A Cricketing View, an irregular podcast about cricket and other things. Hello and welcome to a new episode of A Cricketing View podcast. My guest today is Anthony McGowan, a writer of fiction and non-fiction for all ages, from children to young adults to older adults. He's also associated with the Authors 11. He's actually their opening batsman. Today we're going to talk about cheating in sport, which is a subject I've long been interested in. Thank you for joining me, Anthony. Welcome.
It's a pleasure so far. Always nice to talk about my favourite subjects, cricket, philosophy and cheating.
Just to give listeners a bit of background, the reason I was hoping to get Anthony to come on the show is because, one, I know he's a philosopher, and two, I recently read an essay of his where he discusses the ethics of walking from different philosophical standpoints. So, Anthony, could you tell my listeners a little bit about how you got into philosophy and cricket?
Oh, sure. I mean, I spent many years studying philosophy. I did various degrees and then sort of abandoned it, left it behind me. And I had a number of careers, none of them very successful, until I became a writer. And I was principally a writer, in fact, still am principally a writer for young people, for teenagers and younger children. But I always had this vague guilt about not having used all this philosophy that I'd acquired in my head. And so I decided to write an introduction to philosophy, which is structured around a series of walks I take with my dog, Monty. So it's a very light-hearted way of getting into philosophy. It's basically like a Socratic dialogue between me and the dog. So I wrote this book. It's called How to Teach Philosophy to Your Dog. That came out. And then I also have the other important part of my life is cricket. And there's a very good cricket magazine called The Night Watchman, where you can write long format pieces for them. And so I thought I'd combine the two. So I wrote this. I suppose it's basically meant to be an introduction to the whole of philosophical ethics, but examined through the prism of the ethics of walking in cricket.
That's a really wonderful way to introduce some of these fairly dense and complicated ideas, isn't it? Just to use an example like walking.
Yes, and it also helped clarify the ideas in my own mind. Sometimes you don't quite know what you think about an issue until you really work through it in that kind of way.
I always find sort of discussions about cheating to be especially fascinating because we always try to rationalize cheating. We try to say rationally that, this is right or this is wrong or this is legal or this is illegal. And so far as the legality and illegality goes, under the laws of cricket, we can usually get somewhere to some sort of resolution. Yeah. But when it comes to right and wrong, it sort of immediately stops being a purely rational exercise, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I thought that walking is particularly useful in this way because not walking, for example, it's not technically cheating. You're not breaking any of the laws of cricket. I mean, there are some vaguely analogous situations. If you're a fielder, excuse me, and you take a low catch, and that's so that you've taken it on the half volley, and you still claim the catch. Now that is straightforwardly cheating, and it's against the laws of cricket. You've pretended you took a catch which you didn't really take, and so unambiguously, if you get away with that, you've cheated. I think it's different with walking. If you get a very fine edge and you don't walk, and you're not given out by the umpire, you simply haven't cheated. There may be a spirit of cricket concept floating around in there. You may even get called a cheat, but you haven't actually broken a law of cricket. So that's why I thought it's particularly useful, because it then becomes purely an ethical issue. So do you choose to live that lie? I suppose you might think of it more broadly in relation to lying in general. That there are a few specific situations in which it's a criminal offence to tell a lie. If you commit a fraud, or if you pretend you're a medical doctor and treat people when you're not really a medical doctor, that's a kind of criminal case of lying. But most cases of lying are not, in fact, crimes. To tell someone you love them when you don't love them is not a crime. It may be immoral, but it's not a crime. So I was trying to find an example of that in sport, which is where cricket and walking came in. Although as a sporting person, I'd be intrigued if you can think of any other situations in any other sports where you have that case where it's purely a moral issue rather than actually infringing a law. I couldn't think of any actually exactly analogous situations.
today, I suppose you would refer to maybe diving in football
Oh
as
yeah,
being
yeah,
analogous.
yeah.
But I think you make an interesting point there about the laws of cricket as well, because under the laws, the appeal is actually a legal process, whereas walking is not, and that's the distinction. That's the asymmetry, right, between
Yeah.
because an appeal is sort of a necessary part of the process of dismissal.
Yes, you can't be out unless you appeal.
I'll give you another example, which came to mind. Fred Truman wrote about this in his book, and he wrote about one of his tours of Australia. And since we're talking about cheating, it's probably a good idea to introduce the Australians into the
Of course.
conversation early.
Before you start, you've got to be a little bit careful about Fred. He was well
Yeah.
known as someone who would occasionally exaggerate and elaborate his stories. But let's see how realistic this one is.
A ball of fire is full of stories about how various constituencies within the game and society were, unfair to Mr. Truman.
Yes, of course.
And one of them is Australian umpires. And Fred tells his story about how he went into bat one evening. I think it was Sydney or Melbourne, one of those things. And Wally Grout was the wicketkeeper. And Truman, of course, went down on his knees to sweep. And he missed the ball, and Grout collected it and broke the bails and, bellowed an appeal. And apparently, as he did that, under his breath, he whispered to Truman, don't worry, Fred, you're fine. I'm just keeping them on their toes. And lo and behold, the umpire gives him out.
You're giving out.
And of course, in Truman's story, Grout is all apologetic at the end, saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, Fred. I didn't think they would be so stupid." So this sort of begins as a story, I think, about how things are generally sketchy in Australia, and ends up being about how umpires are stupid. So what he's describing there, in a sense, is what today we would call a professional appeal. I mean, Adam
Yeah.
Gilchrist was supposed to do this, as a matter of course. Wicket-keepers are supposed to. So it's part of their art to game the umpire, to game the.
Yeah, I suspect that takes place more at a higher level than the one I actually play at. Weirdly, it's a bit of a tangent. I've always found as a batsman, I'm not quite, but almost on the same side as the wicketkeeper. We both have similar challenges, and so one of the things I always do when I go out to bat is to try and establish a little bit of a rapport with the keeper. Say hello, have a smile, have a joke with them. So I've never noticed at my level, particularly the wicketkeeper, gaming it in that sort of way, but I'm sure that when you get to a more professional or even semi-professional level, it happens all the time.
Yeah. Oh, I'm definitely. Oh, this is. You need to be worthy of being watched on TV to do anything of this kind.
Well, I'll never reach that level. Not now.
Where are we on the sort of the line between lying and not lying, and cheating and not cheating?
Well, I think that I suppose I picked walking as an example of this because I think you always know if you feather that ball. You never don't know. There's something about that little tingle of energy you get from even the finest of edges. So there you absolutely know. Well, if you're a medium pace bowler, you come huffing and puffing in. You might think it's going to go down the leg side and you put up an appeal, but you never quite know. So I think that I wanted that absolute clarity of the batsman knowing he's edged it and then either making that choice to walk or not walk. I think in most of the other situations on the cricket field, it's never quite that crystal clear.
I suppose you would call it sharp practice, isn't it? I've never understood what that phrase means. It seems to be, a way to sort of evade the accusation of lying without actually evading any of the substantial accusation of lying.
Yeah.
It's sharp practice, for instance, to have the third fielder on the leg side exactly bang on square, but tending towards, behind square.
Okay.
And so the fielder will sort of move in or out as the bowler is running into bowl, and all sorts of shenanigans, all sorts of stuffuggery. You can see why it's happening, but clearly there's some connection between why they're doing it and the fact that they know it's completely wrong, right? Because it seems to me that one of the sort of features of lying is that everybody seems to agree that it happens very often and it is always wrong.
Well, I suppose that there are situations in everyday life where it might be a bit more ambiguous than that. That if you have someone cooks you a meal and you say that was delicious, when it actually wasn't, I think there you might try and make a moral defence of lying from a utilitarian point of view. I'm not sure if there are cricket examples there, but I think in the professional game, I think there is that massive pressure on the players to push that line a bit. So, just because there's so much at stake in the professional game. So there's psychological pressures from your teammates, from your own need to succeed, from the fact that so much depends on it, in terms of your own, financial and professional life. So they're the examples you give of that sharp practice, and that seems to be pushing us far towards that line as you can get away with. But I'm not sure if is that still the same as lying?
Well, if you get away with it, that's another interesting feature, right? I mean,
yeah. Although I remembered an example from my own playing career, modest though it is. But back when I was a younger man, I used to open the bowling for my team in the Yorkshire League. At a reasonably high level then. I was a fairly quick outswing bowler. And it was back in the heyday of towards the end of the career of Michael Holding. And Michael Holding would occasionally come off a shorter run-up. And so that was often his quicker ball. And so lots of people at the lower level used to kind of copy that Michael Holding technique of occasionally coming off a shorter run-up. But I used to occasionally begin walking back as if I was going to go back to the end of my long run-up, and then just suddenly pivot and come in sneakily off the short run-up to try and catch the batsman slightly by surprise. Yeah. And that was undoubtedly sharp practice. And I was only a 16-year-old kid and didn't really have the morality clear in my own head. But I did it once too often. My captain took me off and didn't bowl me for the rest of the season as punishment for this this morally ambiguous act. So I never did it again after that. So I suppose that would be an example, I suppose, where in fact I'd pushed the line so far that it probably was cheating. And I'm not sure which. You probably know the laws of cricket better than I do. Is there which law of cricket would that break? Sneakily coming off a short, really? Even if you're doing it slightly to catch the batsman off guard, or was it?
No, the batsman can back out. If the batsman doesn't, then it's his own fault. I mean, okay. It's not your fault.
I should have carried on doing it then. I'm now angry at my captain for taking me off all those years ago.
That sort of brings up an interesting question, isn't it? This whole question of being constrained by rules, because it is the rules which define transgressions, right? The transgressions exist because there are rules. Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, sport is such a purely competitive thing where, every play in the game, every ball, both sides are trying to improve their position at the expense of the opposition. Right? So in a sense, it is totally a contest. There's no part of it which is not a contest. Right? So in that sense, it is sort of supposed to be both, absolutely constrained by rules and absolutely competitive.
Yeah.
That seems to be an irreconcilable tension, isn't it?
It's well put, but also it's so fantastically complicated. I mean, cricket's a complicated game at the best of times, but also the different psychological complexities that the players bring to that situation. I mean, even at the amateur level, we have players who are much more competitive and who will push those lines, and who would never ever consider walking. Then we have the more the captain of the Authors 11 cricket team, Charlie Campbell, is an old Etonian. He's an incredibly honourable person, and he would always walk. And often in the field, he's called back batsmen on several occasions when he was concerned that catch might not have been cleanly taken, even though I thought it was. So he's on very much on that side of the line. So he brings his external morality very much into the game and pulls him in one direction, whereas our more hard-nosed players would bring their own morality and pull it in a different direction. So all these different complex psychological elements get mixed in with those already complicated rules, and that then male competitiveness that kind of kicks in there as well, and perhaps temporarily obscures your moral judgments. It's the beauty of the game.
if you are sort of prepared, like, J.R. Vishwanath famously, recalled Bob Taylor in that test match, I forget which one, or when he was caught at the wicket, or he was given caught at the wicket. And, there's always been this nagging suspicion that, J.R. Vishwanath, he was too nice to be India captain. He was not competitive.
Well, who was the batsman again? Was it, did you say Bob Taylor?
Yeah, the wicketkeeper.
Well, I wonder then again if the fact that Bob Taylor not being a brilliant batsman might have helped the captain make that decision.
He was in a stand, though, I think.
But again, as a batsman, something I wrote about in my article, I think that you're much more likely to walk if maybe you've hit a belligerent 70 odd or got 100 than if you've got one or two, or it's your first or second ball. I think then it's a much harder job to walk. Although I think again I said in the piece, I was trying to remember in my entire career of I've been playing cricket at league and friendly level for 40 years longer. I've had I think only 2 occasions when I could have walked. I hit the ball and wasn't given out by the umpire. And on one occasion I walked. On the other occasion I was thinking about it and the umpire called over and I stayed there. So what was my point? But I suppose it just hasn't happened to me very often. But I do wonder though if I would bring those extraneous elements which would pull my decision one way or the other. Those kind of non-moral factors about the state of the game, my own personal form. So I don't know. It's a tricky one.
What you seem to be getting at is this idea that the decision to cheat or to walk or to not walk, it's often taken in the moment.
Yes.
That it is often not some sort of cold-blooded, matter of conviction.
Yeah. But I suppose you may well get some players who, I don't know if it was really established that Gilchrist always walked, but might have this policy which they bring onto the field, and then they don't ever have to think about it, they just always walk. But that, again, part of the point of my article was to look at how different moral philosophies would address this situation. And so, if you're a Kantian, then you have a rule that says you never lie, or interpreting cricket terms, that you always walk. A utilitarian, the kind of view that's often contrasted with Kant, says in fact to be properly moral, you have to make a complicated calculation and work out what's the way of maximising utility or happiness in that situation. And sometimes that might be to walk, and sometimes it might be to stay. So I think you have to make that kind of, you have to decide what kind of moral person am I? Am I a Kantian, a utilitarian, an Aristotelian, a Stoic, an Epicurean? These all pull you in different directions.
Was Nietzsche right then? Are convictions worse than lies?
For Nietzsche, morality is all about the individual making those choices. So if you are the Superman, then you can do whatever you want. So I think that he thinks that convictions are all important. If you certainly in some of the works in Thus Spake Zarathustra, it's all about your belief, and that's what. And you should always be true to your own inner convictions. And you can lie if necessary. You can cheat. You can steal. You can kill if you're the Superman, or an Australian, I suppose.
That was sort of what I was getting at, right? Because Nietzsche's whole point is that, well, to use a unfortunate contemporary example, if you're Boris Johnson, you can get away with it. So if you're Donald Trump, you can get away with it. Whereas if you're like me or you probably couldn't get away with it.
We might try, but no.
We've sort of got to this idea that, the decision to lie or to cheat is perhaps often made in the moment. And, then sort of you come to this notion that, well, how prone are people likely to be to sort of fall prey to the moment in that way? And is there a possibility that there are people who, out of convictions, out of their absolute confidence in their supremacy, are always absolutely sure that they are right, whatever decision they're making?
But we've all played with cricketers like that, haven't we? I can think of at least 3 in my own team. Not going to name any names. But I suppose that what I think, my own view on this is that I do have my own moral philosophy, which is basically utilitarianism. And I try to live my life by that. But occasionally I'll fail, whether on the cricket field or in the outside world. But there, I think that what you then have to do is to say, yes, fair cop, I failed. So, but you are right to criticise me for not living up to my own standards.
Yeah.
So, if you like, this is where there's a kind of nexus that you can, when you're in that moment of decision, so you know you've edged that ball, and you think, shall I walk or shall I not walk? And you know that what you should do, according to your own philosophy, whether it's Kantian or utilitarian, and then you decide to not follow your own rule. Now that's a psychological decision that you've made, and then what you must do is put yourself is accept the verdict of the moral law that yes, you've been wrong, even if you stay there. And so I think that then is a way of perhaps redeeming yourself as a moral agent, even once you've done made that moral mistake. Well, so you say, it's a fair cop, you've got me, I'll serve my time.
But is that redemption something for your benefit, or is that redemption for your social standing?
Well, it may well be both. I certainly, to go back to your slightly earlier point, I've got teammates who will never admit that they were wrong. So there was a game last year where I was I batted, I was out, and one of my teammates came in, and he hit a low full toss to mid on and was caught out. And the bowler didn't. I mean, nobody appealed. It was an absolutely straightforward low full toss catch, and the batsman didn't walk. He just stayed there. And I looked at him, and the bowler looked at him, and he said, "Oh, I bumped it."
Yeah.
I said, no, you didn't. And he said, I did. I bumped it, and he stayed there, and none of us quite knew what to do. And in the end, the bowler kind of shrugged, and their captain sort of shrugged, and we just played on. And I talked to him afterwards, and he just convinced himself that he bumped it. And so I don't know. I suppose I take that is a very, I suppose, Nietzschean kind of view, that he simply could not accept the fact that he'd been wrong, and so he had a reality distortion field then that kind of kicked in.
I mean, it's also the George Costanza view, isn't it? It's that, it's not a lie if you believe it.
Well,
but I mean, this idea of sort of the cocksure, superstar, supremely self-confident, maestro has a long history in the game, isn't it? I mean, we say a lot of things about the great West Indian sides, but you look back at videos and you read about reports from that time, and there's always this undercurrent about especially when the games were in the West Indies, you would have Viv Richards and other big players rushing umpires and
yes, yeah,
appealing in an intimidatory fashion, and
I remember it well, yes.
And all these commentators back in the day when they were much more restrained than they are now, they would notice it.
Yeah.
I think that made it all the more effective because they were so restrained. We still remember it, isn't it? I mean, and that was at least sharp practice, if not more, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I remember a particular case was Rob Bailey. It was the what was it, the 89?
No,
was it that? But he was caught down the leg side. And Viv kind of went up for the appeal and then charging down to the umpire and made the umpire change his mind. And clearly Bailey hadn't tickled it. But I think that meant so much, though, because Viv was captain after years of not being captain. Cricket was so important to the West Indies, and also they were beginning to lose that absolute invulnerability, weren't they?
Yes.
So there was so much at stake there. I don't think Viv was cheating there. I think just the heat of the moment and the desire took control. I mean, going back 100 years before that to there was even more blatant examples of that. The great W.G. Grace was notorious for cheating. There's all kinds of examples about him. I remember there was a famous story where there's a very windy day, and a bowler bowling against him flicked the off bail and Grace just bent down and put it back on again, and said to the umpire, "Very windy day today, umpire." The umpire said, "Well, mind it doesn't blow your hat off on the way back to the pavilion." That's one time, but other times, but he'd refused to leave, and his famous saying was, "They've come to watch me bat, not you bowl," to the bowler. So, and that was a time when gambling was perhaps even more central to cricket than it is now. So there were big financial pressures as well. People would bet on how many runs the doctor scored. So it's by no means a new phenomena, sharp practice.
I remain fascinated by this paradox, or at least this tension between. So on the one hand, virtue being identified on the basis of winning, and on the other hand, virtue being identified on the basis of self-restraint. It is a very, very liberal view of the world, isn't it?
Well, I suppose what I was trying to do in my piece, in my essay, my article, was to get people to try and think clearly about what it means to be moral, or to act morally, or to act virtuously. Because for most of us in our everyday life, we don't ever bring it into sharp focus. Most of us think that we're basically good people, and we on the whole try to do roughly the right sort of thing in life, if not always in cricket. But then when you try and find out exactly what a person means by the right thing, then often it starts to collapse, or they'll have contradictory views about virtue. So I suppose I was trying to get people to decide, what are you? Is it right to always follow a rule? Is it right to try and, in any situation, assess where the maximum happiness lies? Or is morality a matter of certain virtues which you always follow or adopt, make part of your personality? Or is it just a matter of pleasure? Is virtue a myth? And in fact, we all the time simply do try and maximize our own enjoyment and pleasure. So I think that once you begin to think carefully, morally, that you might spend the rest of your life trying to work out the answer to these questions. But I think it does make you a more interesting person, a more complex person, and perhaps even one day a better person. So can I ask you, are you a walker, Kartik?
It depends.
It depends. What a cop out.
It depends on whether I like the opponents.
You know what? There is a truth in that. We have teams that we play every season, and we've got friendships form, and there are teams that that they're, in inverted commas, that they're the nice teams, and perhaps we all would take a more generous spirit attitude when we play against them.
I'll give you an example, right? When I was a schoolboy in school, I used to play tennis a little bit, and used to play these friendly games with friends, right? And there was this one friend, and we were playing this game, and I thought I'd won a point, and he said it was out, and I was absolutely convinced that he knew it was in, and that he had said it was out. And I couldn't. Then of course we didn't have like anybody else. There was no umpire or anything. Right. So then he lobbed me, and it was a great lob. I'll admit it now. It was a great lob.
Oh, you didn't call it out, did you? Oh.
I called it out. And that was like purely out of spite, In that moment, I was absolutely convinced that justice demanded that this thing be called out.
What, in the sense of kind of cosmic balance, or?
Yeah, but I'm not 14 now, right? But when I was 14, I did think that way.
Yeah. Although I think that's a very good example of a case where it's clearly cheating to call a ball out when you know it's in.
Yeah.
So that is but I going back to walking, even if you know you've hit it and you don't walk, you stay there, you haven't cheated.
Yeah.
So I think that so one is clearly a black and white issue. The other one is more shaded, more nuanced.
I see. So I do want to get to another side of this idea, right? Which is the way some things are perceived to be cheating. So the classic example is, of course, bunkering, which is not cheating.
No, not cheating at all. No.
It's perfectly legal. But the other, interestingly, is throwing.
Ah.
Isn't it? I mean, bowlers who throw, oddly enough, are considered cheats,
Yeah.
even though it is a purely a technical infraction. If you bowl a front foot no ball, nobody says you're cheating.
Mm.
But if you have a kink in your action which shows up in one variation,
Yeah.
then suddenly you're like this cheat.
But I mean, throwing is a fascinating area, and clearly, I think most people historically who've thrown the ball weren't aware they were doing it.
Yeah.
There's a famous case of the English spinner Tony Lott from the 50s and 60s, who he had his faster ball. Everyone kind of knew he was chucking it, except him. And when he finally saw a bit of film of him doing it, he thought, "Oh my God, have I been doing that all these years? That's awful." So I think that generally speaking, and obviously that there like Murali, he had that disability in his elbow, so he couldn't. So it looked like his arm was bent. Actually, he's a bad example because he wasn't throwing it at all. But so most throwers in inverted commas just don't know they're doing it. But I think there were historically a couple that knew and would occasionally throw in deliberately throw it together and get more pace in there. I think it was probably more prevalent among spinners than quick bowlers even. But I used to be a bowler. I've actually tried to throw it in the net. It's actually really hard. If you're used to having a broadly straight arm, it's almost impossible. I found to accurately chuck it. So I don't know. But it's for some reason throwing had a particular moral taint to it back in the days, more than almost anything else in cricket. And it's hard to know quite why.
And these sort of things have taken on a life of their own, isn't it? I mean, that even just yesterday, I was seeing, there's this conversation on Twitter about, who's the greatest bowler of all time, and someone says, Murali, he had to have the law changed to benefit it, so he's just a non-starter. This cheating and the perception of cheating it's not a matter of fact, isn't it?
Well, I think there are in certain issues where it appears to be kind of more clear cut than others. But actually, this takes me back to one of the book that I wrote before that from which the article kind of emerged. I was trying to work out, did I have an overall a kind of guiding concept in it? And as a book, as I wrote the book, it did seem to me that almost all the problems in philosophy, both ethics and the other areas of philosophy, came down to the fact that most of the concepts that we use and the words we try and describe them are fuzzy. And there's a paradox about that describes this called the Sorites paradox, which was one of the early Stoics came up with, which is the paradox of the heap. And so it's basically if you've got a pile of sand, how many grains of sand you need to make a pile. Obviously 3 isn't a pile, and 1,000 probably is a pile, but it's very hard to just define at which point just some sand becomes a pile. Or there's it's given another form of one of the other Stoic philosophers, which is in relation to being bald. So clearly if you have no hair on your head, you're bald. If you have a full head of hair, you're not bald. But at some point the full head becomes a bald head. And is it 10 hairs or 50 hairs? So it's almost, you can never actually say, because the concepts of a pile and the concepts of baldness are fuzzy. They're not precisely defined.
Yes.
And I think so often in morality, again, you get that problem of strictly defining it. So even just defining cheating is in fact, as we just discovered today, is a fuzzy concept. That there's not a clear dividing line between absolute fairness and absolute cheating. We've got a vague idea that we know what's cheating, and a vague idea we know what's fair, just as we've got a vague idea that we know what bald is and what a full head of hair is. But it's when you get down to those fine distinctions that it becomes essentially impossible. And so I think that's why we will never solve the problems of philosophy, because you've got, in a way, you've got too much fuzziness there. But the fuzziness of the complexity of the real world than the fuzziness of our attempts to map language onto that real world. And that difficulty in philosophy, you can read it across to cricket or many other areas of life.
In the last part of this conversation, I want to bring up 2 episodes, I should say, or 2 subjects, which I think almost all the listeners will agree are, squarely questions of cheating, but they are completely opposed to each other, and even so, they are cheating. The first is ball tampering. Right from Steve Smith and Cameron Bancroft and sandpaper and Shahid Afridi trying to take a bite out of the cricket ball. And Marcus Trescothick, chewing Murray mints and then dropping them onto the pitch and then frantically, kneeling on the ground to gather them up before the umpire noticed like what the hell was going on. That's one form of sharp practice, right? It's one form of trying to get an illegal advantage in an underhanded way. And the other is spot fixing. Which is you're not really cheating the opponent, you're cheating the game itself. The first arises out of a desire to gain a competitive advantage within the game. And the other arises out of a disregard for the competition within the game. Isn't it?
Yeah, but even on that first one, the one you think is unambiguously cheating, ball tampering, but again, there's some fuzziness. If you're wearing sun cream and the sun cream gets mixed with the sweat which you rub into the ball, is that cheating? Is that using artificial substance?
That depends on how you interpret the law, isn't it?
Yeah. So, but clearly, often, as you say, there's the taking some sandpaper onto the pitch and rasping away at the ball. None of us would defend that. So, and the second case of the match fixing, I suppose that takes into the wider area of morality outside sport, doesn't it? But I don't know about you, but I've occasionally wondered what I would do in that situation. If you're paid enough simply to bowl a no ball, and it's not going to affect the outcome of the game, or it's very unlikely to, would you have the moral character to turn down that $10,000 or whatever I don't know what the currency of match fixing is. You kind of hope he would, but again, I said I was a utilitarian at the beginning, and this is one of the every moral worldview can be challenged, and you could challenge utilitarianism by saying, well, it would in fact be right for me to take that $10,000 because the happiness I would feel, the benefit to me, would more than outweigh the mild unhappiness within the game. Although I suppose it would distort the betting, wouldn't it? So people would lose out. I don't know.
Let's come back to the let's come back to the ball tampering, in the end. But I think you bring up an interesting point about the fixing. This is something that has sort of disturbed me a little bit in so many ways, in that I found it impossible to feel any sort of betrayal from any of this. I find myself not getting riled up by it at all. Whereas I would get riled up by an opposing captain, rushing the umpire or something like that. That would really rile me up.
So what's the distinction then? What?
There's an aspect of tragedy in the fiction, right? I mean, these people they're getting into bad company. They're getting into all sorts of compromised situations. I've spoken to ex-players who, were in teams where this might have been happening. And they've basically said that, these people, it's not just a choice about, do I take the 10,000 or do I not take the 10,000? In many of these cases, there's a stick also. There are traps of all sorts.
I know that they get lured in, don't they? Initially, it seems very innocent. You just talk about, the weather or the playing conditions or whatever, and then suddenly...
And they're in trouble. And, when you're 18 or 19 or 20, I mean, I have a lot of empathy for people who find themselves in that terrible situation and, have not had the good sense to sense it immediately and get out of it right at the very beginning.
We several years ago we went on a tour to India, and we played against the Rajasthan Royals in a friendly game. They didn't put out their strongest team, but they had Srikant was their captain. And what an utterly delightful, lovely man. And yet he spiraled down. I don't know.
Yeah, that's sort of why I find it very difficult to get mad or feel any sort of disgust or rage at fixing. I just think that it's a tragedy. It's sort of it's an externality in the game which.
So your kind of human sympathy kicks in there.
Yeah, but I have friends who have no sympathy for these people. I have friends who are absolutely, I'm convinced, sincerely, very, very angry about these people and their betrayal. And I think I like cricket, but I do not feel any rage at this betrayal, and this bothers me. I'm wondering whether I sort of lose moral fiber in a sense.
Well, but are the friends of yours who are most opposed to match fixing, are they the ones who most worship cricket for its history and institutions? I can see that if you do have this glorified view of cricket as this pure, perfect thing, then you might see match fixing as undermining that.
But perhaps I think they're also, how should I put this? They're also more patriotic about cricket than I am.
Well, that's the other issue we've not really talked about: the extent to which your own personal allegiances distort your perceptions here. There was a famous example from a couple of Ashes series ago where Stuart Broad edged, was it Lyons or it was one of the Australian slow bowlers behind, and he got this massive edge and he was caught at first slip. And he didn't walk, and the umpire mysteriously didn't. The neutral umpire just didn't give it. And obviously this enraged the Australians, and all Australian supporters couldn't believe this flagrant cheating as they saw it. And yet most Brits, even those of us who are generally in favour of walking, thought, it's Australians, it's fine, it's just stay there. So you could see your own commitment distorting your moral viewpoint a bit there. That's an interesting example, isn't it? Because if walking is about doing something that is at odds with what you know to be true, then what difference does it make how thick the edge was? No difference at all. I think it was so extreme. I think that they felt there was some rule of etiquette almost that was broken there.
You're picking up the wrong fork,
But it was a joy to see the Australian faces, the outrage. It was just another example, because obviously Stuart Broad is he's someone who does push the lines.
He's Australian.
It's quite Australian. Also, he's got an evil streak in him, which is why certainly when he was younger. But one of the best players in our team, he's an all-round. When he started out, he was still quite a quick bowler, and he used to occasionally bowl a deliberate beamer. Especially if a batsman tried to come down the wicket to him, he'd bowl a beamer. And it's something I'd never really seen before. And he said it was quite common. He played league cricket in the Midlands. And but is bowling a beamer? Is it cheating? What are the laws of cricket on that? So, but it's clearly it's a dangerous and I'd say probably an immoral thing to do, because that really is trying to inflict injury on a batsman. And I suppose when you bowl a bouncer, you try to do the same thing as well, aren't you?
Well, I mean, to the extent that the deliberate beamer falls under 41, which is fair and unfair play,
right?
That does sort of signal that it is the game takes a dim view of it.
Yeah, but that does usually get outrage, moral outrage as well, doesn't it? The beamer, in the same way that chucking it, I suppose.
Yeah. How you react to an event which is sort of might in some quarters be considered below the belt or cheating or underhanded or what have you, so reveals something about yourself as an observer of the game, isn't it?
Yeah. Cricket is it's so brilliant in so many ways for exposing the reality of your soul, as a player and an observer. But I suppose that's again the point of this article was to get the readers and then the watchers and the players of cricket to try and think as clearly as they can about their own personal morality, and then how that intersects with this game of cricket.
let me end by sort of bringing up the question of justice.
Ah.
Steve Smith and his two friends, did they get justice by being banned for a year? No, not by the cricket authorities, by their own employer.
Yeah. Oh, blimey. This is right at the end of the podcast. You asked me that one. Well, I got the feeling that in some sense that they felt that they'd been treated justly, didn't they? I didn't get the impression that they felt outraged by the punishment. And that to me suggests that it may well have been the right thing to do, but it's fantastically complicated, the whole issue of justice. We could go into Plato's Republic and see if that helps us, but I'm not sure it will very much.
This is in a sense just to not hide behind that big word. I mean it in the sense of the aggrieved party being made whole again. That is justice, isn't it? Some sort of, that is recompense in some sense, isn't it?
I think that is one view of justice. Another view is just justice means that the existing laws are being enacted fairly. So obviously within the laws of cricket, there aren't any penalties laid down, are there, for this sort of thing in terms of
3 games?
So 3 games, is that in the laws of cricket?
No, it's the ICC's code of conduct, right?
Okay, sure. But I got the feeling that generally speaking, the cricket world, felt that the punishment there seemed broadly right, or is that I got? I obviously don't know the players at all, but I didn't get a sense of outrage from anyone about that penalty.
No, I thought the 3 games and money, the biggest punishment available for ball tampering, that all 3 of them got that was absolutely fine with me.
Yeah.
The 1 year ban I thought was sort of,
it was too harsh.
Corporate cowardice. all sorts of Australian suits are trying to protect themselves. They failed in the end because most of them had to resign. But when the British Prime Minister and the Australian Prime Minister and every newspaper in the country gets involved and has an opinion, then I suppose there has to be some some valve has to be let loose to sort of let the steam out.
I guess it just suddenly remind me of the the bodyline controversy, where there, again, I'm not sure to this day to what extent any laws of cricket were broken by the bodyline tactic, but it was perceived to be unfair, perceived to be cheating, and there again that there had to be a sacrificial victim for it, and that was Harold Larwood, who was just doing what his captain told him. And
that's the one part of Bodyline which I think was deeply unfair. That the axe fell on Larwood and not on Jard.
Yeah, he was hounded out of the game. I'm not sure. Did he play for England again? I'm not sure that he did. So that again, I suppose, was a quest to try and show justice being done, and in fact, it was the opposite. It was
But Bodyline itself, there was nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's perfectly legal.
Were there laws back then against intimidatory bowling? Had that not or?
Well, I don't know that the bowling was intimidatory. I always thought that the whole point of leg theory was to use, if you had really quick bowlers, you could then bowl short and set a leg trap where you had 4 leg slips.
Yeah.
So that any time the batsman fends, it's likely to go to hand.
Yeah.
Nowadays they do it. I mean, Jofra Archer did it to Steve Smith just a few months ago, and it was very well done. But unfortunately, under the rules, she could only have 2 fielders behind.
Yeah.
There was no rule like that at the time, so it was perfectly legitimate to use it.
Yeah.
I mean, if the batsman wants to sort of get hit, that's the batsman's fault. I mean, he can just fend it and get out. If it's a choice between getting out and getting hit, and you choose to get hit, then it's on you.
But also, I think that it's partly used as a way simply of controlling the scoring, because it's very hard then to score at all. If that's you can always duck. I suppose that's you just keep trying to get out of the way if it's leg side.
You can hit it for 6.
You could. How many sixes did Bradman hit in his career? It's not very many, is it? Is it 1 or 2?
That's a good question.
I think it's very, very few.
Yeah. How do we think through the whole Steve Smith situation? There is a restorative aspect of the year-long break, right? It did sort of get them out of the firing line. It give them time to sort things out, because they were clearly in trouble as a team. So they might have been dropped anyway, but it would have been one thing for the selectors to drop them, or to leave them out for a series or two. It was completely different for their employer to sack them for, not living up to the standards of their employer.
I hadn't really thought about that aspect of it. But as well, there's something about that act. It was embarrassing, wasn't it?
Yes.
It just was deeply embarrassing.
It was clumsy.
Yeah. Would you ball tamper? What do you reckon? But again, our same fast bowler that would bowl the Beamers, he would always have a wine gum in his mouth. Wine gum's kind of a gelatin-based sweet, which he would use to smear on the shiny side. So a bit like the Murray mints, but fruit flavored. So you'd smell the ball after a while. The ball would always smell quite fruity when he'd been bowling.
Yeah, that would be interesting, wouldn't it? To smell the ball at the end of the day of Test cricket. I don't know if I would. I might.
If you didn't like the opposition, is it?
It depends. If I hated the opposition, then I think it's easy to say that you wouldn't. But I think the point you made earlier was an important point, which is that if it's a combination of malice and incompetence, there's at least a significant amount of incompetence at work. I mean, what is it they say? Never attribute to malice that which can be explained by incompetence. I think
very good. But I suppose I was just trying to step back and think around it. That I do think that it's possible to adopt a moral framework in your general life and then take that onto the cricket field. And try to live up to it. And occasionally you're going to fail. So there's that your own personal morality aspect of it. And then there's us on the outside judging those people as individuals making those decisions. And that's when we have to take
without any awareness of the morality at work, isn't it?
Well, yes, often. But so what you're saying about you having sympathy and understanding for those involved in match fixing. So you look at each individual case and see the pressures on those young men on the whole, and then maybe have an act of forgiveness or understand that there were complexities at work there. But so I think there's us as moral agents doing what we do. Then there's the general way in which those acts can be judged. And you might use different criteria for both of those two different things. I genuinely think that it's probably a good thing to try and decide what kind of person you are and then try and live that on a cricket field as well. But then being human, often we're going to fail.
That's I think a great note to end on. Well, thank you, Anthony. This has been a pleasure. I'm not sure if listeners are going to be more inclined or less inclined to be hostile to cheating after listening to this. Or maybe they'll be sort of more inclined to think of me as a cheat. But either ways, I think this is to their profit. So thank you.
My pleasure. Cheers.